Hi everyone. This video is going to present some information regarding comma rules. We are going to explore a few common comma rules in order to help you in understanding when and where to use commas in your writing. Before we get started, I want to highlight some misperceptions regarding comma usage. So for many of us who are not familiar with the comma rules, we tend to rely on some of these misperceptions in order to use commas because we know that when we are writing, at some point a comma is going to probably be necessary. So for many of us, we tend to think that long sentences automatically equates a comma. And we know that that's not always the case because there are rules that we need to follow. Now, in some instances when we do use commas, they are for stylistic purposes, but in this video I want to highlight namely the ones that you're going to use for academic writing, which tends to follow the standard comma rules that are going to be presented in this video. So with the long sentences, remember that you have a lot going on. There's different functions happening at the same time. We have different words functioning in one way. We have phrases being used in one way. And so whenever we throw commas in random places, we may be interrupting those functions and actually messing up the sentence more than we think we're actually helping it. The other thing that people rely on is this idea that they can hear when a comma is needed, or that there's going to be a pause, or just because you're reading it, you feel there's a need to be a pause there. In some instances that may be the case, but chances are you're probably actually following a standard comma rule and just not understanding how exactly to execute it effectively. So I want to get you guys a little bit away from that and really just try to use commas following these rules. And if you watch the other video that focused on combining sentences, it kind of is the same way, where once we recognize the different patterns, it doesn't really stray that far from these different patterns and rules for the most part. So many of these rules then tend to have a certain function or what they're aiming to do, which, as you can see, are three different reasons. So first, it could be for separating elements in a sentence. And when I say the word element, I kind of mean things like words or phrases, or we could use it to add some emphasis. So sometimes when we're structuring sentences in a particular way, we want to specifically add emphasis for clarity purposes, or to emphasize a concept because you're really trying to drive that concept home for your reader. And then also just for sentence variety. So it kind of reverts back to the sentence combining, that if we want to make longer sentences, then we can use commas to assist, but it's not always the case. The other thing to understand is that you can have several comma rules happening at the same time. And it's a little trippy to see because it could feel a little overwhelming, but when you trust and know that you're using the comma for the specific reason that you're supposed to and following the rules, then you don't really have anything to worry about. So what I want to highlight for this particular video then is the common comma rules that in academic writing we tend to follow a certain type of pattern of writing. And so in the they say, I say text, you'll notice those sort of templates and phrases. And we don't stray too far off of that kind of writing. So therefore, these rules are going to help you in executing that. So we have introductory elements, compound sentences, items in a series, essential and non-essential information, appositives, interrupters, and adjectives. And I'm going to provide some explanations for all of these. Some are longer than others, so I apologize, but it's important to follow these explanations so you can understand why these rules are actually in place, okay? So as you're writing too, in order to break bad habits, it's going to be important for you to acknowledge what you do already with comma rules. So what I mean by that is if you know that you're using commas in a cavalier way, not really processing, then it does take work, okay? So let's go ahead and look at commas with introductory phrases first. These are sometimes the easiest ones actually, so because you can kind of see it. that one is needed. But let me go ahead and explain what I mean by introductory phrases or elements, right? So in each one of these sentences, you'll notice that there is a comma in all of them. And so I always tell students to always look what's happening before and look what's happening after, okay? Since we know that this is an introductory element, it would mean that anything before the comma is that introductory element. And based off that principle, what happens on the other side of the comma then should be complete sentences. Okay, so you'll notice in every single one of these sentences, they are complete. The students rush toward the door. Smith uses humor to cover grammar rules. The girls were in fits of laughter, and Max didn't go to the game. Ideally, we can remove every single one of these introductory elements, and that sentence could be standing on its own just fine. But why do we add introductory elements? Well, as I said before, to add emphasis, to add clarity, so we know what's going on. And so before we talk about the comma rule, let's look at this. So quickly tells us how the students rush toward the door. Inner book tells us where Smith uses humor. Kicking and giggling tells us how the girls were in fits of laughter or what the reaction was. And then we have what the clause. So we can only use a dependent clause as an introductory element, and more on that later. But because we have the word because here, I already know if I have a word like because, since, even though, I'm starting one of these dependent clause intros, and so it's going to tell us the effect, okay, or excuse me, the reason why Max didn't go to the game. Instead of saying Max didn't go to the game, the reason why he didn't go to the game is because, so sometimes we write like that. So this helps us in combining those concepts. So every time you have one of these introductory elements, whether it's a short word like this or telling us how, where, when, and or reason, then we know that a comma is immediately going to follow. If you don't know whether or not you're putting it in the right spot, I always revert back to the rule as I said before, which is basically look what's happening before, look what's happening after. If the after is a complete sentence, there's a good chance you probably put it in the correct spot, okay? So those are your introductory phrases. So moving on to the next one, we have commas that are used in a compound sentence. So earlier in the semester, I put out a video that talked about combining sentences or combining clauses. And in this instance, we are going to only focus on the and, but, or, for, nor, yet. So the fanboys, the conjunctions, and we know that we can combine sentences. So a quick review, whenever we use those and use them with a comma, we are absolutely checking to see if what comes before and what comes after are both complete sentences. So we have the class began at noon. He didn't arrive until 1. So complete sentence, complete sentence. And so here we have the comma and then the word and, but, for, nor, yet. And so, okay. You'll notice in the second one, though, we have and we have so. And so, as I said to you before, always look what's happening before and what's happening after. And before, we have my boss. That is not a complete sentence. And right away, I know that no comma is going to be used because the word and is functioning differently here. The word and is combining not sentences, but combining nouns. Boss, I, in this case pronoun, and not trying to combine a sentence. The moment it's trying to combine two complete sentences, that is where we put the comma and the conjunction next to it. So very similar to this sentence, Lisa went to the bank and she withdrew $50. So on either side, we have complete sentences. You might ask that, you write a sentence that doesn't necessarily repeat the word she. So Lisa went to the bank and withdrew $50. That's definitely something you can write if you wanted to. And if you, in fact, did write it without the word she, then you will need to remove the comma. Okay, so even though these are little minuscule nitpicky type stuff, it is the rule. So depending on what you have, that you ask yourself, complete sentences on either side, then use the comma. Without them, you take them out. Now, a little trick that I like to tell my students, because we use those words a lot, is to go into the find function in Microsoft Word and type in the word and it'll bring up all the instances that you use and then just look before, look after, and then go in and determine whether or not it needs the comma by determining whether or not there's complete sentence on either side. Next, we have commas with items in a series. So I think this is a pretty common rule for people, but I include it just because I wanted to highlight that you can list out many things. You can list out on a word level, list out on a phrase level, or to provide descriptive words, right? So here we have homework in math, English, and science. Okay, so we have our commas in the spot to list them out individually. You'll notice that some cases, some people put the comma there and some don't. I say in academic writing, it's probably better to err on the side of clarity, so to put the comma after or before the end. In the instance, the family went to the movies, so we are listing out a phrase here. So we have first went to the movies, ate dinner at a restaurant, and slept at a hotel while on vacation. So one thing I want to highlight, which is called parallel structure, and I'm going to include this in a video later in the semester, but you want to look for balance. So we have went, ate, and slept. Now, first of all, those are all action words, so that balance is there. And then they're all past tense. So you want to make sure that you maintain every single one of those in the same way. In other words, parallel, okay? But as I said, we will talk about more about that later. And then finally, descriptive words, just make sure they're all descriptive as well. And then you have your commas to make it clear. Now, what happens when you are listing out a phrase or something that is using another comma rule and you have it in there? Whenever you're listing out something that already has commas in it, then you are going to use semicolons to list that out. Okay, so if you have questions about that, you can just email me, but it's pretty straightforward. So. Next, when we're talking about essential information and non-essential information, I want to kind of break it down what I mean by that. So we have what's called phrases, and I've mentioned that in the combining clauses video as well. But phrases are, of course, phrases that can't stand alone. They need to be inserted into these sentences, and many times the purpose for these phrases, of course, is to add clarity, as I said, or to add emphasis. Okay, there are instances where we will use a phrase that will require commas, and instances where we will use a phrase that don't require commas. I want to talk about that first. So if we look at this first sentence here, the students who come late to class are inconsiderate. Okay, the first thing we have is the students. That's our first breakdown, which is the main action or subject. Here we have who come late to class. We have a key word here, who. And then finally we have our verb, are, and then we have our information that tells us what they are. Okay, now I can pull this phrase out, who come late to class, and I would be left with the students are inconsiderate, which of course, as you already can hear, it is a complete sentence and there's nothing wrong with that. But if I just go up to you, or if I'm writing something and I say the students are inconsiderate, your likely response is, what students? Okay, so in order to clarify that, I need to include an essential phrase for clarity, which is who come late to class. Words like who and which, and especially that every time you use it is always an essential phrase, which means you'll never use a comma before the word that. Pretty easy, right? Well, in this instance, look for those, because there's a good chance that you're inserting a phrase here, and ask yourself, do I need it here for clarification? If you do, if it's absolutely necessary for your reader to know who you're talking about, then remove the commas, okay? Let's look at this one. People who reject evolution are usually quite religious. Of course, again, we can say people are usually quite religious, but if we say that, we're not sure who we're talking about, so we add the phrase who reject evolution for clarification purposes, okay? Now again, if you see the word that, then it is an essential information. The word which, however, can be essential or non-essential, okay? So with commas and non-essential information, we are going to include the commas. So as I said, the non-essential is sort of the by the way sort of information that is only adding for clarification purposes to the sentence. So in these two examples, we have Micah, who received an MVP award, will play for North Carolina next year. So in the instance, if the writer and the speaker, it is assumed that they know that who Micah is, so we don't need to know that Micah won or received an MVP award. It's just a by the way or added information. So in those instances, we'll actually put the comma before and after that particular phrase. Again, you see the key word here, which is whom. Next, we have Maureen, forgetting it was a holiday, went to the bank to make a deposit. So again, we know that Maureen and the fact that she went to make a deposit, we added that she forgot it was a holiday, not really all that important in the sense of what we might say next. So in this particular instance, we're focusing on the fact that Maureen went to the bank to make a deposit, okay? So as I said before about the word which and that, and I want to kind of set a reminder that the word which can be used with a comma or without. More often than not, usually you will see a comma with which, especially in academic writing, but the word that very rarely or never is going to have a comma, okay? Now, moving on, I want to address why this matters. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at two sentences that are identical. And the only difference between the two is the first sentence has commas there, and then the second does not. And I want you to take a moment to see what might that mean as far as like a difference is concerned in regards to why an author might include the commas there or might not. Now, as a reminder, the commas that are included there are just by the way. They're not important for us to have in order to make sense of the sentence or to know the meaning. Whereas if we leave the commas out, for instance, we know that it is an essential phrase. It's absolutely necessary to have that phrase in there for clarification. So if I was speaking, and this is a real world scenario, I have 7 brothers, and if I was speaking to a person or they were reading a letter that I happened to write, my brother who lives in Omaha won the lottery last week. Well, in this instance, it's not important for them to know who lives in Omaha because of the commas there. That would indicate that I only have one brother because it's not important for them to know that he lives in Omaha, that the reader will understand that the one and only brother I have won the lottery. In the second sentence, my brother who lives in Omaha won the lottery last week, it's important for that information to be there. It's stressing the fact and emphasizing the fact that I have multiple brothers, and it's important to know which one I'm speaking of in regards to the lottery winner last week. Okay, so it might seem minor, but these sorts of things are very important, especially as it relates to contracts, law, legal matters. You know, it might seem irrelevant to you at the time, but again, these sorts of things matter when it comes to bits in regards to clarity, meaning, understanding, and so forth. Also, too, one thing to think about is just the fact that it saves you a step in adding another sentence. So if you said, my brother won the lottery last week, it's the brother that lives in Omaha, you know, so it kind of sort of prevents this unnecessary need for creating additional sentences when you can actually clarify it in just the one, okay? So moving on, looking at the next comma, we are using commas for what we call unofficially interrupters. And ultimately, interrupters are just that. It's words or phrases that interrupt the flow of a sentence for a reason. Sometimes it could be contrast, sometimes it could be for emphasis, adding information, whatever the case might be. But ultimately, one thing to remember is that we can remove that interrupter and that sentence can still make sense. So if we look at all of these, we have no, she did not attend class last week. She did, however, find time to go to Cancun. I did, in fact, fail her for her excessive absences, and the policy was spelled out in the syllabus, wasn't it? So each one of these, I don't need the word no in the sentence. I could just say she did not attend class last week. But by adding the no, I'm aware as a reader that I'm answering the question to something. Here, she did, however, find time to go to Cancun. If I just had she did find time to go to Cancun, The however places emphasis in the fact that it could either be a little sarcasm, there could be an understanding that she was supposed to be doing something else, like going to class, for example, but instead went to Cancun. So by adding these little words or interrupters here, we add clarification and emphasis. As I said before, we don't always need it, but if you're wanting to stress a particular point, having sometimes these minor interrupters here will be helpful. And so we are able to execute that by comma usage. So if we put it at the beginning, we only need 1 comma. If we put it in the middle, we can put 2 commas around it. And then if we put it at the end, the comma comes before. Remember that with phrases like these, they can move around pretty freely throughout the sentence. So we can just simply say, no, she did not attend class last week. However is one that's very flexible. We could say, however, comma, she did find time. We can also say she did find time to go to Cancun, however. So it's entirely up to you. We can also say, in fact, comma, I did fail her for excessive absences. That can also go in the beginning or at the end. So it's really up to you where you want to put it, but just make sure that they're marked by the commas so we know and can read it in the intended way that you wish to as the author. Okay. So moving on, when we are looking at other comma rules, in some instances, these comma rules are going to be aligned with grammatical functions. And in this instance, we can look to adjectives. So adjectives, if you're not aware, are descriptive terms, or as we call them officially, they're modifiers, which means they give us more information about the thing it's modifying. So whether it's person, place, thing, whatever. We have this concept called order of adjectives, which basically means that there is an order in which adjectives can be listed out should you decide to use multiple adjectives in a single sentence. When that happens, or when we decide to use multiple adjectives, there is an instance where we can either use the comma, or in fact, when we can use the comma, then instances where we are not permitted to use the comma. So that's kind of what this rule is. So when you are listing out these commas, you need to ask yourself 2 things. 1, can I reverse the order of the adjectives without messing up the known order of adjectives, or can I use the word and in between them? So for example, we have, they are clean, neat, tidy people. Clean, neat, and tidy are all on the same level in the order of adjectives, so they can actually be placed anywhere in that sentence. So we can say they're neat, tidy, clean, or we can say they are neat, clean, tidy, however you want. The other rule applies here too. We can say they are clean and neat and tidy people. You have the choice of putting and there or the comma. It's up to you, but something needs to be there either way. Sometimes in persuasive writing and speeches, people will use the word and for emphasis. So if I really wanted to stress how clean and neat and tidy these people were, I'm probably going to use the and. If I just want a clean description and a flow in my writing without forcing stops on my reader, then I would just simply put the comma there. They're clean, neat, tidy people. In the second example, we have the 3 young Italian women were featured at the panel. So we have 3 young Italian, which are all our adjectives or modifiers. You'll notice that we don't have the comma there, and we can't put the word and because we have different kinds of adjectives. So the order of adjectives is different. So we can't move it around. We can't say the 3 and young and Italian women. We're not going to say the young 3 Italian, the Italian 3 young. We can't do that. So in those instances, when you do that test for the and the moving around freely of the adjectives, if you can't do it, then you remove the commas in this instance. For the purpose of demonstrating some comma rules, I decided to use my own essay that I've written for the courses that I am taking for master's degree program that I'm in. Just as a heads up, as far as the content is concerned, it is forensic linguistics, which means we have to understand criminology, crime theory, and apply it to cases that exist in our country. And so with this one, is focusing on the JonBenet Ramsey case and tie-in. Okay, so with this, I'm going to highlight the different points for comma usage, and this particular page here provides a good combination of all of the comma usage that we talked about here in the video. So right away, you'll notice that you can see the word while here. And with starting the sentence while, I already know that I'm going to need a comma after this phrase. So here I have, while the ransom note should be analyzed from a forensic linguistic perspective, comma, for the purpose of this case study, comma, the note will be analyzed as if it were in fact written by who the author claims to be a foreign faction. Now we have a couple of comma usage happening here, but as I said in the video, you want to treat each one differently as if you were generating a new type of sentence. So in the first one, we know the keyword while here is going to present a comma, and then on the other side of this should be a complete sentence. So what ends up happening is we have another intro phrase that will introduce this sentence here. So for instance, for the purpose of this case study, comma, that would act as an intro for this complete sentence. The note will be analyzed as if it were in fact written, and so forth. Okay, so we have our first intro phrase using the keyword while, and then we have another intro phrase using for, and then it connects to our complete sentence here. Moving on, I have another intro phrase at this point, comma, and then as you know, on the other side of that should be a complete sentence. It is assumed that Jean Benet is kidnapped and not yet dead. Okay. From there, I have another keyword according to, and so I'm introducing a study here. So the comma is going to come after that. In the instance, because I am using parenthetical citation, it's going to come after it. But if I didn't have parenthetical citation, then it would come after this period here. So again, we can eliminate this and we still have a complete sentence. They define kidnapping as the unlawful taking and detention of an individual agent against their will, often with the threat use of violence. All right, so moving on. Next, now we don't have one of these intro words, but we still have a comma here. A key word that should stick out to you is the word but. And so this is when we are trying to combine two complete sentences. So let's go ahead and examine that. Kidnappings can be classified in different ways. Okay, we have our first sentence. On the other side should be a complete sentence as well. They are categorized broadly under three main categories. And then we have our list here: ransom, political, and abductions. So in this instance, we're incorporating two. This one is combining the complete sentences, comma, but, and then here we have our listing. If you recall and watch the other video about combining sentences, another way to do that is through semicolon usage. And so here is what you're looking at, okay? As we move on, already I see the keyword since. I know that I'm going to need a comma after, since the letter points to a kidnapping for ransom, comma. So we should have a complete sentence after this. There becomes a clear connection to, and then the rest of the information, okay? All right, again, we have another intro phrase to make this connection, and then we should have a complete sentence. We must examine K&R on two levels, okay? So as we skip ahead, we see another comma here, but we also know we have more intro phrases for those who engage in kidnap for ransom as a common criminal, comma, and then a complete sentence. We can point to strain theory to understand this type of crime. Again, for those seeking, so the keyword for is going to let us know that there's an intro phrase, again, complete sentence after. Okay, so here we now have another one. This is using the semicolon, however, comma scenario. So it is important to note that not all strain individuals turn to crime. However, strain theory suggests. And so in this instance, we're actually using it as a function, again, to combine two complete sentences. This again refers to the other video about combining clauses, okay? Right away, we see the word in the case of K&R, comma. This is our intro phrase yet again. And then we have a complete sentence after. This type of subculture presents itself in a specific way. We have another for here, which means we have a comma, and then another according, which means we have a comma after. We have some more listings. So you see it becomes the same pretty much rules over and over again. And it doesn't really fall too far away from these structures. And you'll notice too, as a side note, like the different types of same structured sentences you have throughout, it just keeps it clear, concise, straight to the point. And again, as some of the strategies that I suggest is look for those key words, words like through, under, since, while, even though, things like that, okay? So anyway, one more I want to highlight is even though you saw a lot of introductory phrases, here we can also use a singular word as an introductory phrase. So similarly, comma, victims find themselves occupying spaces that reflect their social status and financial status in life because of their everyday patterns. Another intro, as such, comma, the very nature of life they live target themselves to these offenders, okay? And then again, same introductory phrases and so forth. Okay. So with that being said, it might be a good idea to go ahead and take a look at your own writing, look for some patterns in the way that you develop your sentences. If you're noticing keywords like while or in or under, using some of those prepositional phrases as we call them, or introductory words, it's going to be a good idea to be mindful that you are putting and placing the comma in the correct spot. All right. If you have any further questions, feel free to email me or, as I said, practice them on your own using your own writing.